Welcome to One Planet Conservation Awareness. Today we are talking about ecosystem services. Why are healthy ecosystems so important and how humans rely on these systems so heavily? We are joined by Tony Juniper, writer, campaigner, environmentalist, and also the chair of Natural England, the UK's advisory group for the protection and restoration of our natural systems. So welcome to you, Tony. I learned about ecosystems at university, but it wasn't until I read your book, What Has Nature Ever Done for Us, that I started really to become interested in the world of ecosystem services. So perhaps you could start us off by explaining what we mean by ecosystem services and introduce us to what has nature ever done for us.
So nice to see you, Jordan. So the first time I came across this idea of ecosystem services, I was reading a master's in conservation science back in 1987 and was just struck by the power of the idea of natural systems, ecosystems, actually being vital for the functioning of the economy. And the reason why I thought that was such a powerful idea was because until then, and indeed even still today in the early 20th, 21st century, we still have this view prevailing in some areas that we have to sacrifice nature in order to grow the economy. And we can't have economic growth or improve living standards unless we sacrifice nature. And so this idea of ecosystem services kind of went directly against that and struck me at the time as being one of the most important arguments we could harness in favor of conservation. And the basic idea is that ecosystems like wetlands or forests or coastal sand dunes, those ecosystems provide humankind with a series of services and benefits. And so if you have those places intact, an intact wetland that is full of moisture and which is functioning with its hydrological processes intact, it's actually giving us quite a lot of benefits, even though very often we don't see them. So from a wetland, one benefit would be reducing flood risk downstream. As water's coming off of hills, it's going into a wetland area and the water's being intercepted there and it's not rushing off all at once, thereby flooding people's homes and businesses. It's doing that service. And, you know, if you start to work out how much that is worth, you start getting some big numbers. And then you can work out what it's doing for water quality. So every home likes to have fresh water coming into it through taps, and those taps are supplying water from the environment ultimately. The cost of that water is much lower to get into your house when it's coming from a healthy ecosystem. If it's already been polluted and is full of soil sediments and nutrients and pesticides, then that water is more expensive because you have to clean it before putting it into the home. If it's coming from a healthy ecosystem, there's another service right there that we're getting. Another service that very same wetland will be providing is catching carbon from the atmosphere and accumulating that in peat and other ecosystem components. That's unrotted plant remains, taking CO2 from the atmosphere, turning it into plant material, and then building up a layer of that in the wet ground, thereby keeping it out of the atmosphere and slowing down climate change. And then on top of that, it may be that the wetland is fantastic for birds. And so people come there on their holidays and they stay in the local B&B, they spend money in the local shops, and you find another ecosystem service benefit coming there. So that idea that nature, when it's intact and functioning, is more useful to the economy when it's been cut down and turned into, well, in that case, a wetland could be turned into grow bags of peat that you buy in the garden centre. You get a bit of money from that, but actually the value you take from that for the economy is much less than the long-term value you get from carbon capture, flood risk reduction, the purification of water, and the beautiful landscapes that people visit. So this is a powerful idea, and what I try to do through various writing projects over the years is to draw that out a little bit and to show people that actually nature could be doing a whole lot more for us if we invested in its protection and restoration rather than continued with its degradation. And happily, that story now, I think, is more widely understood and more people are beginning to believe that, which is good.
And I think something you mentioned in the book, and I've heard you talk about previously, is putting the monetary value on these services that quite often we don't realize until we lose them. I think the best example that springs to mind from your book is the vultures in India. When the vultures disappeared, and more feral dogs came, more disease came, more deaths came, and the cost on healthcare increased. But we hear about these issues of flooding in Bangladesh and rabies perhaps in India. But what are some of these services in the UK, and what kind of monetary value are we seeing in terms of ecosystem services in the UK?
So this idea of putting a monetary value on those services, it's controversial, complicated. It does have some utility and can be useful in some circumstances. And in this country, I suppose one ecosystem type that's getting a lot of attention at the moment is peatlands. And so some of the upland blanket bogs along the Pennines and in the north of England, increasingly we're seeing, as a result of some of these big flood events, the extent to which those systems being degraded and the extent to which they no longer hold as much water as they used to, we're seeing a reduction in the ecosystem service and therefore costs being incurred downstream. And so one way of calculating the value of those ecosystem services is to say, well, how much would it cost us to defend the homes and towns downstream from those places with concrete defences, compared with how much it would cost us to repair those systems upstream? And you very often find that actually it's more cost effective to conserve and restore the ecosystems upstream than it is to build the downstream defences. And when you start looking at it like that, you can start to generate some economic value. On top of that, you'd want to look at the water purification value. And so in the north of England, water companies like United Utilities and Yorkshire Water have been actively working on the restoration of peatlands in order to make purer water come off of the hillside, because it means then they need to spend less money on machinery and technology and chemicals to remove soil particles and peat from the water before supplying to the public. And so that's then an economic value that they can see, in which they can reflect into the business models that they have. And then on top of that, of course, is the cost of carbon and different ways at looking at the benefits of holding that carbon in the hillside. So at the moment, we're about to spend tens of billions of pounds on the construction of nuclear power stations, which will reduce the CO2 coming from the electricity sector. And so that kind of investment can give you some sense of how much it costs to reduce a ton of carbon from that kind of technology. And then you can look at the peat bog and say, okay, so if it's costing us that much there, what kind of investment should we make into the hillside and the recovery of the peat in order to make a cost-effective contribution to reducing climate change? And as I've repeatedly pointed out, this is not really about putting a price on nature. It's much more about recognizing where value lies. And it may not be that necessarily you'd be charging for those ecosystem services or you'd be putting them into a market, but by making those economic calculations in terms of flooding, water purity and carbon, you may say that those peatlands should be protected as a matter of law. It's illegal to damage them now because we've understood that they're so valuable for society. And so that's something I think which is a really quite an important point to draw out in this, because some people react against the idea of calculating ecosystem service values because they think somehow this is going to commodify nature, turn it into a market instrument, which then, degrades it and means that we lose public ownership and public control of things that really should be representing the common good. But I don't think it has to go down that route. And in fact, if you look at what has been the result of understanding different ecosystem service values over the years, it's not really markets that we finish up with. It's generally regulatory codes, shifting of subsidies, changing of the nature of relationships between different landowners, people investing differently, water companies, for example. So I don't think this is necessarily the danger that many people portray it to be, although of course, with any route towards conserving the environment, there's upsides and downsides, and like everything else, this has got its downsides as well as upsides.
You mentioned subsidies with land use, but do you think that subsidies could be used as kind of a reward system to reward landowners who, introduce beavers onto their land for wetlands or introduce wildflower meadows for their pollinators? Do you think that this monetary value could be used as kind of a reward system to encourage not only protection, but potentially some rewilding as well?
Well, this is exactly where policy is going, finally. And so in my book, What Nature Does for Britain, I basically reached the conclusion that we should be switching all of the agricultural subsidies in the country to be payments for ecosystem services. And I didn't think when I wrote that within a few years that would actually be the government's policy, which it is. We're just at the process in the moment in the UK, in England at least, of switching away from the regime of the Common Agricultural Policy, which was an EU strategy going back many decades, which basically for one period was rewarding farmers for producing more. In this country, latterly, it's been about rewarding people for keeping land in agricultural production. What we're now going to do with that money post-Brexit is to basically be turning it into payments for ecosystem services. So instead of paying farmers for keeping their fields in food producing condition, this will now pay for carbon capture in hedgerows, trees and soils. It will pay for river water purity. It will pay for cleaning up the air in terms of reducing emissions from different agricultural practices. It will be paying people for improving the wildlife populations in the countryside, improving the landscape beauty and providing for public access and thereby public health and well-being. All of these things are deemed by economists to be so-called public goods. That is, things that are valuable for society, but which you can't buy in the shops. And so this is where public subsidies can actually then maximize those public goods in a way which is going to benefit society, but which won't happen through the market. The idea being that food is sold in the market, and so that can continue as something which is a transaction between consumer and producer. But for those public goods, which presently and hitherto have been largely invisible in economics, we can actually make them visible through switching those subsidies into being payments for ecosystem services. And this I find very exciting. For many years, I've seen different analysis making the case to switch farm subsidies, which presently across the world have been devastating nature, putting CO2 into the atmosphere, driving ecosystem damage. About $500 billion worth of that is being paid out across the planet every year. Imagine what you could do with that kind of money if you switched it from subsidies to destroy and into payments for services, including reforestation, regeneration of soils, rebuilding of ecosystem networks, which is what we're going to do here, including rewilding. That's part of the plan in England. And that couldn't be more welcome, I think, in terms of signalling the direction of travel for the future and starting to shift subsidies which have been backing what we now know to be the wrong thing with our new analysis of the value of nature, and to begin backing the right thing, which is to start restoring those hugely valuable and essential services. And at Natural England, we're very much looking forward to not only working with government in designing that scheme, but also to be working on its implementation later on, including some of these very ambitious landscape scale pilots that were announced at the end of last year that will be looking at least 2,000 hectare blocks, which will begin to look at some of these landscape recovery opportunities, including some rewilding.
So you mentioned your involvement with Natural England. As chair of Natural England recently, yeah. Can you introduce to people that aren't too clear about Natural England's work, just what their role is in UK conservation and the protection of our ecosystems?
Well, we are a complicated animal, it has to be said. So Natural England today is the ancestor of agencies that were first set up in the late 1940s at the end, just after the end of the Second World War, when we had the first official conservation efforts in the UK. And over the 70 plus years since then, the official nature conservation effort run by the government has been evolving. And today you find Natural England is the successor body of what was originally back then the Nature Conservancy. And over those many, many years, there's been different acts of parliament passed, different policies adopted, to the point today where Natural England is responsible for about 400 different legal powers and duties, from the licensing of different kinds of wildlife management through to the designation of sites of special scientific interest, the declaration of national parks, and even licensing of campsites. And so we've got this incredible range of different duties, which makes us quite a hard thing to explain to the casual observer. But at the end of the day, the Act of Parliament that establishes us says that our duty, our purpose, is for the conservation and enhancement of the natural environment in England. And that's what I take out every morning when I get out of bed and get to work, is the conservation and enhancement of the environment in England, working with a whole range of other government departments and actors, plus also many private sector partners, including some that I've mentioned already, including farmers and water companies. So we've got a very broad set of functions, but we've got 4 big areas that we focus the work in. So one is sustainable food production, whether that's on land from farms or in the sea from fish. Sustainable development, which is about the role we play in the planning system, and the work we do on wildlife licensing, which is a big area of activity for us. We have another area which is around connecting people with nature, which links to the work we do in the designation of areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks, plus the public access that we provide to national nature reserves. And that's a really big issue at the moment with the lockdown effects, obviously. And then the 4th area is around so-called resilient landscapes and seas, which is about the protection of what we've got. So the sites of special scientific interest, which cover 8% of England. This is a very big area. It's a million hectares of land, which is designated. But now the job we see is not only the protection of those remnants, which we began to identify in the late 1940s. Now the job is much more about recovery of nature and trying to reconnect some of those fragments of habitat that are now lying very often in very intensively farmed landscapes, but which need to be reconnected to conserve their wildlife. And then that brings us to what is now Natural England's mission today, which is not only about the protection of what we've got, it's about the recovery of nature. And so this idea of building partnerships for nature's recovery is really the mission that you would hear from us if you asked us, what are you all about? What is the thing that you're trying to do? Build partnerships for nature's recovery is the core of what it is today, for all the reasons I've mentioned: sustainable food, public health and well-being, sustainable management of the environment, and of course, ultimately, the conservation of nature.
So a really broad array of aspects of the environment and biodiversity conservation as well. And of course, all of these sectors are interchanging as well, the protection of current areas and the linking of them together, but also sustainable development. And this links into the government's new 25-year environmental plan, which focuses on the idea of net biodiversity gains. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what these net biodiversity gains are, what do they mean, and what is Natural England's role in making sure and doing the research for these net gains?
So the 25-year environment plan is an excellent document. Once we get into seeing some of the opportunities there, you can see it's really very rich with things that we can be getting on with. And at the core of it, and this is the most important thing, is this idea that we're going to leave nature in a better state than we found it over the period of this plan. And that's the first time we've had that in an official conservation document. It's always been about slowing down the losses or hanging on to what we've got. This is the first time we've had a government policy which basically says we're going to make things better. And so one of the ideas in there is this idea of a nature recovery network. And this is, again, very close to the ideas in the mission of Natural England today, is to make that nature recovery network happen. And some of the tools to do that I've mentioned. There's the existing protected areas, there's the new farm policy and switching subsidies from land management and into ecosystem services. And then another tool that we've got is this idea of net gain. And this very much links to development. And so one of the big pressures on the land, of course, is food production. Another big pressure, which we read a lot about at the moment, of course, is house building and also infrastructure. And when it comes to the house building side, there will be in the Environment Bill, when it becomes an Act of Parliament, hopefully later this year, a new provision in there which will basically require there to be an increase in biodiversity compared with what existed before a housing development goes ahead, if that makes sense. So you can imagine an area with some semi-natural grassland, maybe a bit of woodland. They wouldn't be designated or protected because that lies outside the net gain rule book. But the idea would be when you have those kinds of good, useful habitats, but ones which aren't protected, but which get damaged or obliterated as a result of a housing development, you'd first look to avoid those good places, then you'd look to mitigate the damage, and where you can't mitigate the damage, you would have to undertake to achieve a net gain through the development. So this would mean basically paying someone to do some habitat creation somewhere else at a level which is a 10% increase on what you had before. And so the role that we have at the moment is really about trying to understand how you measure the biodiversity before and after, and what kind of rule book you would need to create to be able to make sure that that nature in the future was in good shape. So you didn't finish up with tokenistic things that didn't do a lot of good, but which would be there for the long term. And then all sorts of complexities around whether you would bundle together different net gains from lots of different housing developments to do one big project, or whether you scatter them around to do smaller projects more locally. This is work in progress. But the basic idea actually is quite a breakthrough. And I'm hoping over the years ahead, we'll begin to generate quite a lot more money for conservation, given that those houses are going to go ahead anyway. And then this is one of the, the deep tensions in conservation in the world everywhere, is that the world does not stand still. It's going to develop. There's going to be new roads. There's going to be new ports. There's going to be trade. There's going to be new technologies. There's going to be shifting away from fossil fuels to renewables. There's going to be more houses needed. And so all of this stuff, we have to accommodate it in the best possible way in order to achieve uplifts for conservation on the far side. That's the way I look at it anyway. I mean, there's always, a very legitimate debate to be had about, well, do we need that development and should we be doing something else? And yes, people will have those conversations, and perfectly right too, but recognizing that some of it will go ahead, it's going to be good to get some benefit from it, I would say.
And I think this is something that's under fire a lot at the moment with the construction of HS2, and many people are worried that the destruction of these patches of ancient woodland are going to be mitigated, but not in the correct way. People are worried that instead of these ancient woodlands, there's going to be a monoculture of trees planted elsewhere. So what is Natural England doing and researching to make sure that, maybe not like for like, but to get that 10%? How can you get 10% on, ancient woodland? What are kind of the ideas and ways in which you're going about this?
Yeah. Well, presently, major infrastructure, including HS2, isn't required to do biodiversity net gain. So there's a gap there already. And this is one of the things that I've said as we've been going along and the Environment Bill has been drafted, is that ideally we should have this idea of biodiversity net gain not only applied to housing developments, but also major infrastructure projects like nuclear power stations, like airports, like major railway routes, because obviously, they're going to have a very considerable impact on the landscape. And so that argument continues, that discussion continues, and hopefully at some point we will finish up with there being a legal requirement for projects like HS2 to do biodiversity net gain. It doesn't have it yet. They could choose to do it voluntarily and to be working with the Department for Transport on that. And I do hope at some point they will take that view. They haven't done yet, however. But in terms of the impact on ancient woodland, this is something that you can't do a net gain for. It's an irreplaceable habitat. And it's kind of something you would have to take the view that it's worth the damage and loss to that ecosystem because of the overriding importance of the project that's going to damage it. And that was the choice made in relation to HS2 through an Act of Parliament back in 2015. So that wasn't a decision from Natural England, that was a decision by Parliament following a recommendation from government saying that this railway project was of overriding importance to the UK economy, and therefore it would be legitimate to damage areas that, to all intents and purposes, over any reasonable timescale, are irreplaceable. Definition of ancient woodlands is that they're pre-1600, so it's going to take at least 400 years to get them back, to a state they're in, which is kind of beyond any kind of planning horizon of any government that I've ever seen. So, this is a very big picture choice that was taken, and it was taken, with the facts on the table. It was reviewed during the Oakavia review. A lot of people fed in views saying that they didn't think it was a good project, and other people said they did think it was a good project. And, you know, that was a debate that went on, and then government decided that it would go ahead with it. Now, once the government has decided that it would go ahead with it, our role at Natural England is to ensure that the law is upheld. And so this includes, for example, licensing of disturbance to protected animals. And so along that route, various known locations for bats. Bats are protected, and if you're going to disturb a roosting or breeding site of bats, you need to get a license from Natural England. And we've been working with HS2 to help them get the legalities of that right, given that the project has been given the go-ahead, not by Natural England, but by a choice of government and parliament. And it's our job at that stage to make it as good as it can be within the law, recognising at the moment that we don't have that big ambition to achieve net gain, but we're very happy to continue discussing that. And if at any point HS2 and government did want to make the project biodiversity net gain, we would help to achieve that and do the very best we could, recognising that some of the things that are going to be damaged, you can't replace them. But there's a lot you can do, and a lot of things you could create and do really quite a good job on over the course of this project, and leave a legacy that would actually be better than what might otherwise be the case, if we put it like that.
So you talk about leaving a legacy, and I think as Natural England's role, there's no one better to run this idea of net gain and ecosystem services than yourself. I don't think there's many more people in the world that have a better understanding. So what do you mean by leaving a legacy? What, in your mind, would be the best route in terms of, you know, net gain, rebuilding, rewilding? Yeah. What would be your focus points?
Right, okay, so my starting point would be to look to the idea of the Nature Recovery Network. So this is a government policy. There are some numbers attached to it in the 25-year plan, the creation of 500,000 hectares of good new habitat across the country. Ideally, we wouldn't just be scattering those 500,000 hectares, and hopefully quite a lot more than 500,000 hectares, actually, in my ambition. We wouldn't just be scattering that across the country randomly. What we'd be doing is seeking to reconnect existing areas of decent habitat through creating other areas of good habitat, to build those corridors across the country, whether it be along river valleys, by reconnecting areas of woodland, by building wetlands in places where they used to be but have been drained long since, and to be doing that in a way whereby we're not only recreating opportunities for biodiversity to flourish again across England, but also are building in carbon capture, flood risk reduction, purification of rivers through the way in which we design those habitat creations as we go forward. Now, given the scale of HS2, you could imagine that a net gain from that project would be quite a considerable area of habitat that would be created in order to be able to achieve that goal. And if we took that opportunity and fitted it in to the template of the Nature Recovery Network, understanding that we need more grasslands in this part of the country, more woodlands in this part of the country, rewilding of that river valley, more opportunities for public access to a rewilded green belt in this part of the country, I think we could do something very exciting, which would have, as I say, a legacy that would be a very positive one, alongside hopefully what will be a piece of leading infrastructure that will do the job that it was set out to do. But the environmental piece is something where I think there is opportunities to do more, should that step be made into looking towards net gain as the outcome that was desired.
So it's clear that we know what needs to be done, and Natural England do a lot of work on understanding the needs of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we know what needs to be done. But do you think the UK has what it takes to be a leader in this recovery? And do you think our government has what it takes to put, you know, the money where the mouth is? And do you think they will push this through? And if not, what can the public, who do seem to be having this awakening of green consciousness, what can the public do to put pressure on the government to follow through with Natural England's ideas of this legacy?
Well, I think the combination of pennies dropping around that idea of ecosystems being vital for the economy and society, rather than just being something that gets in the way of development. That penny has dropped at some pretty senior levels in government. Last week, we had the publication of the so-called Das Gupta Review, which basically is saying many of the things that I said in my books around the value of nature to the economy. And it's all very well me writing that stuff, but actually that was a review led by the British Treasury, which is a very different place to get that kind of thinking coming from. So I do think there is an awakening and a series of pennies dropping in very important places in terms of government policy. At the same time, as you say, there's been this very dramatic uplift in public awareness and the understanding of the scale and the urgency of what's now needed. And those two things coming together, I think, now present us with a really quite historic opportunity. And I've been working on this stuff for 35 years, and I don't think I've seen what I see at the moment in terms of the appetite and ambition that's coming from government, coupling with this demand from the public at the same time as you see major companies from, Lloyd's Bank to Tesco's saying similar things again, that they need to be shifting their purpose, not only from being companies that generate profits for shareholders, but also investing in sustainability and building a better world. So all this stuff has come together quite quickly and in an unusual way. And so the opportunities now are, pretty big, especially if you look at that range of policies that government has. 25-year plan, the environment bill with all of the things that are going to be in there, the new agricultural policy, the nature recovery network idea, very ambitious tree planting targets, new targets for the recovery of peatlands. All of this stuff is suddenly on the table. The big challenge now is going to be about delivery and about how we actually get this stuff done on the ground. And it's been quite complicated getting to where we are now in terms of winning the arguments and bringing people along to see that conservation makes sense, not just for environmentalists, but it makes sense for all of society and for economics too. We've actually won that argument now, and can't underestimate the importance of that. The question now is, how are we going to deliver it? And so the first bit was complicated. The second bit is going to be more complicated still. But I think it is about partnerships and about taking an integrated view at landscape level. So thinking of, areas of the country, river catchments, maybe like the River Wye or the River Thames, looking at all the different actors working in that catchment who are determining the outcomes, the farmers, the water companies, the local government, the housing developers, the non-governmental organisation, different government departments, and trying to get them working together to deliver that nature recovery network, which for me, the more I think about it, is the core delivery outcome of all of this. If we can put all these different tools and all these different actors together behind building that nature recovery network, I think that actually is going to be the payoff from this. And so how we plan that and how we put the pieces together to understand what good looks like, that actually is really quite an important piece of work, which is what we're doing at the moment.
It sounds like you're very passionate about this, and it does sound quite hopeful as well. I think it's quite easy these days to suffer from what's being coined as eco-anxiety, or feeling a bit helpless. But actually there is lots of small successes to celebrate, not only in the UK, but around the world. Obviously, it is an uphill battle because there is so much going on against our environment, but there are lots of organisations like Natural England, small and large, doing their bit to protect our natural systems. So what would your message be to the general public of what they can do to start, not pressuring and pushing, but to find out more and become connected to this movement of moving towards a greener future?
Yeah, I think, getting involved with the organisations that are doing a lot of this work on the ground already, and, many people already obviously are supporters of the Wildlife Trust and RSPB, and getting involved with those kinds of groups who are doing some of that thinking in terms of how best to shape government policy and priorities, but also doing the practical work themselves. That's certainly a good thing to do. And I think, during this lockdown period, a lot of people have also been, much more tuned into the local environment and finding ways in which they can benefit from visiting local nature reserves and what have you. And so I think, there's a phrase that you kind of get from people interested in city centres and the high street. They say use it or lose it, in terms of going to the local shops and keeping them open rather than them closing and everyone going to a big supermarket or the internet. And I guess there's something similar there really in terms of local nature spaces and getting them used and made more popular, and thereby, really lifting up their value in the eyes of local decision makers. There's something that everyone can do in that space too, I think.
And I think there's definitely room to be positive, despite things like HS2 and government plans for coal mines. There definitely is room to be positive that the UK can build a greener recovery.
For sure.
So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Pleasure. Nice to see you, Jordan.